Hey there, and welcome to the technical instruction portion of the Key Life Transit Charts. My name is Eric Francis, your astrology teacher for the next half hour or so, who knows, maybe longer. And I'm here to introduce the topic of Key Life Transits and then talk about how to find them. It would help if you were familiar with the concept of a transit, which I'll introduce. There's a lot of kinds of transits in astrology. The word is used in a diversity of ways, but the important thing to remember is that it means movement. And so when we think of a transit, we're talking about movement, but really what most astrologers are talking about when they say transit is movement in comparison to the natal chart. So just as a warm-up, because I want to just, before I get into all the more technical qualities, talk a bit about the concept of a transit, but just to give you a visual. For this session, we're going to be using the chart of my good friend Average Person, born in 1980 on New Year's Day, and I've circled the target planets that we're going to be tracking transits to, and just as a loose example, if even not using one of these, Mars was in Cancer recently. It is still, but it was at this degree range of Cancer recently. And so when Mars is in the sky, which it always is, and it comes past the early degrees of Cancer, Average Person, born on January 1st, 1980, is going to have a transit called Mars conjunct the Moon. If a person has Pluto at 21 Libra, and Saturn comes by as it did a few years ago, the person will have a transit called Saturn conjunct Pluto. That's not to be confused with the natal aspect Saturn conjunct Pluto. So what an astrologer might write is transiting Saturn conjunct Pluto. T Saturn conjunct Pluto, but they don't always write that. But the concept is when a planet in the sky in real time makes any angle to any planet in the chart, could be a conjunction, square, opposition, whatever, that is a transit by the definition that we're using in this class. Our most visceral experience of astrology comes from transits. The natal chart is there all the time. You're born with the natal planets in their placements. However, they are there to explore. You can feel them. You can consider what they are. You can contemplate the effects. But when a transit happens, the natal planet is activated. It is called into focus. It moves from the background into the foreground, and you have a direct experience of that for the most part. Neptune transits can have an opposite effect, but you're still having an experience of that planet. And these can be very pronounced. They can be dramatic. They can come with profound life changes. It all depends upon the transit. Now, for this class, we're talking about key life transits. And what I mean when I say key life transits are the transit experiences that all people of a similar age group have around the same age. So, for example, everyone at age 29-30 has a transit called their Saturn return. which is to say, skipping ahead here for a little bit, just to make sure that we're on the same page when I tell you more about these. Let's see if I've got a lot of things on my music stand here. Saturn. I'll just use this as my last example before I get into a little bit of the personal growth and development aspect of transits, and then I'll come back to the technical, because the personal growth and development aspect of transits is crucial because it is our way of marking progress, and in the course of a lifetime as astrologers, one of the most important ways. Progressions are another. And additionally, these events represent growth opportunities. And when you're working with a client who's going to be having transits, or if you're looking at your own transits, one of the things you need to understand is how the person whose chart it is tends to respond to transit events. And one of the ways you do that is to interview them about it and get some sense of the past. And this is not, to be clear, using the past to predict the future. When astrologers talk about prediction, generally they're talking about transits, to some extent progressions, but very few astrologers are good at progressions and have much experience with them. And so the concept of astrological prediction is largely centered on transits, and I am not talking about that. When I talk about getting an understanding of how you or your client, your kid, your partner responds to transits, that in my astrology shop is not about the purpose of prediction, but rather having a sense of how the person responds when the energy in their chart is turned up. So quite to the contrary of prediction, if you find there is a certain pattern from past transits, your role as the astrologer may be to help guide the person into a different type of pattern. So, that said, just to give an illustration of the Saturn return, an average person born 180 chart, Saturn's at 27 Virgo, and it takes 29 years to come back around, and the Saturn return was in 2009, and that's an example of a transit. And again, there's lots of them, and what I'm limiting this class to are the ones that happen to an age group at a similar time. Just to give a corollary example of the other type of event, let's say the person has an ascendant of 28 Pisces 55. A couple of years ago, well, even last year, Chiron came by. But that is specific to that person's chart because they have a personal angle at 28 55, and anyone of any age born in any year can have 28 Pisces rising and would have had that transit, and might be a 1-year-old has it. Basically, people of every age have that degree of Pisces rising. Not that many, but they could be any age. And so that distinguishes a more directly personal transit from a key life transit, which is a transit that happens to a whole cohort, right? So every year there's a new cohort of people having their Saturn return. As people turn 29, they have their Saturn return. And so when I talk about key life transits, I don't mean to diminish the importance of other transits. They are sometimes quite powerful transits. For example, Pluto conjunct Saturn, or Saturn conjunct Neptune, right? There are all kinds of major transits that happen. But what I want to get started on are the ones that tend to happen to people at a certain developmental stage. One of the reasons why this is so necessary, particularly in American and some other Western cultures, but I know American culture the best, and what I have noticed, and you can assess whether this is accurate for your society if you live somewhere else, Europe, Asia, New Zealand, whatever, is that we tend to not mark progress. And so we end up with high school graduation, maybe college graduation. Most people don't take an advanced degree. If they do, it's generally not a celebrated event. And then there's marriage, have a kid. Some people get divorced. Some people get remarried. And then death. And so this is problematic because one of the most important things we need to do in our culture is to grow up. And growing up means a series of stages of development. And as an astrologer, one of the things that
I found this on the web for a series of stages of development. Check it out.
Siri is getting into the conversation here. We will someday recognize this as fascism. A series of stages of development where you probably may already have come up with a theory of personal development. And one example of that theory is that the Saturn return is a point of maturity. So Steve Forrest said one of my favorite things about the Saturn return when he said, after your Saturn return, if you've completed the work of the Saturn return, you like going to work. It's no longer a chore to go to work. You found work that you like and want to be there. So personally, I've always liked going to work. If I worked in a supermarket or worked as editor-in-chief of the college magazine, I have a lot of Saturn in my chart and not so many Saturn issues. So what he was talking about is, people's typical attitude toward work, where it's work and not play, and they have not necessarily found their calling or their vocation. And what Steve's saying is, by age 30, you should have a sense of your calling or your vocation. And each one of these transits has something akin to that. There's nothing as tangible as that comment about the Saturn return, which is an important maturity point, and it's why it's reasonable to have certain expectations of people over 30. But the problem is that we live in a society where there is severe arrested development, and when there's severe arrested development, astrologers become development counselors, basically, and it's what you are in effect. I mean, you're looking at developments in the person's life as indicated by stages of growth. And so what I'm going to do in this video is point out briefly, just to give you a concept, and then I'm going to copy these charts over and take them down to the plaza and scan them in, so you can see them, in slow motion, how that works, in particular with basically the 5 planets that are counted as being part of key life transits: Chiron, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. These are all slow-moving points, so we don't talk about key life transits with things like inner planets such as Mars or Jupiter. Though the Jupiter cycle is important, I haven't found it to be particularly dramatic. It's connected to the Chinese cycle, 12-year cycle. Chinese astrology is based on a 12-year cycle.